This is part two of the session on Oracle functions. Hi, my name is KD. I'm part of the product team in Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. In the first part of this session, we looked at what are serverless compute options or functions as a service offerings. We looked at the open source FN project on which the Oracle Functions service is based. We looked at an overview of the service as well as some of the key features of this uh, service. So let's start this session by getting into the core concepts for Oracle Functions Service, and then we'll get into IAM services, and then we will actually look under the hood on how we what happens when you deploy a function, and then what happens when you invoke a function. Um, we will have a third part of this session in which we will get into the use cases and an actual demo. I'm going to skip the first few slides because these were covered in part one. I would encourage you to look at part one for some nice background on the topic. But let's start with the first core concept in functions, which is called applications. An application is essentially a logical grouping of functions. You can create an application in OCI console in the Oracle Functions section. I'll quickly show you that. And you do that before you can deploy any function. An application does not need to contain any function, but it's just a logical grouping of functions. Why it is important is because it provides a common context to store the configuration variables that are available to use for all the functions in an application. So let's say you have an application, you have multiple functions in it. All the configuration variables in the application would provide the shared context that can be leveraged by these different functions. You can create applications using the console. We'll look at that. But you can also create it using the FN project CLI, and you can also use the OCI API to do that. Let's uh, look at what the interface looks like from OCI console. So I've logged into the console. Functions are part of the developer services option, and then I click at functions. You choose the right compartment that you want to work in. You see an example application already there, but you can create a new application. You can say you have to choose the compartment in which you want to use it. You then need to specify the subnets in your VCN where you want to create the application. This is important because when functions are created in an application, they are able to leverage other OCI resources in the same subnet. So set it up properly. You can choose other options, but then you can just create an application like that. Once an application is created, you can then get into creating functions. And functions are nothing but blocks of code that you write. You can use any language, but there is first class support for 5 of these languages: Java, Python, Go, Ruby, and Node.js. These blocks of code that you write generally do one simple thing very well, and these are uh, typically designed to be more microservices oriented, not part of monolith. So do one thing, do it well, and do one simple thing. These functions are invoked in response to either a CLI command or the functions themselves expose an HTTP endpoint. You can invoke the function using that HTTP endpoint. You can invoke them through external events or through OCI events and using SDKs as well. Uh, and the functions are deployed as containers themselves. So a definition of the container of sorry, the when you create a function, the definition of the function is stored as metadata in the Oracle Functions service. The definition is going to describe how the function is to be executed. It has to include, we'll look into all of this in detail shortly, but you need to include the Docker image in a specified Docker registry, which is pulled when the function is invoked. This Docker registry could be anywhere, where you can also leverage the OCI or the registry service within OCI. Uh, you also need to specify the maximum length of time the function is allowed to execute and the maximum amount of memory the function is allowed to consume. Then there is the notion of invocations. In Oracle Functions, the function code is executed when the function is invoked, and the invocations can happen uh, using the FN project CLI, like we discussed, using the SDKs, using uh, uh, the OCI event service can invoke it, it can trigger it. And finally, as I was saying, every function automatically gets an HTTP endpoint. You can have signed HTTP requests uh, to this function's invoke endpoint. Um, the when the function is invoked for the very first time, the function's service is going to uh, pull the Docker image from the registry that you have specified and run it as a Docker container. Uh, and if there are, then the system manages the orchestration of when the if the container is not being used, whether to retire it. But if the container is still there and there is another request to the same function, the Oracle Function Service is going to direct those requests to the same container, right? And when there is an idle period, the container itself is removed, but you don't have to care about any of that. It is all managed by the service itself. All you care about is uh, writing the code and deploying it as a function and telling the service when to invoke it. And we also looked at triggers. Triggers are essentially uh, it means that there is some action in the system that sends a request to invoke a function that you have specified using Oracle functions. The trigger event could be something in the OCI event service, or you can also using the HTTPS endpoints also uh, trigger a function using a defined time-based schedule as well. A function, you can associate these specific triggers to a function, or you can have functions uh, with more than one trigger or with no trigger, etc. So quick look at the IAM policies required to work with functions. You would need to write two, uh, at least two policies in the tenancies root compartment. And the first one is about the reading the repositories where the Docker images are stored, and then using the virtual network family in the compartment so that it can leverage uh, the VCN and subnets and its resources. If if you are not part of the administrator group, you can also create a specific group of functions users, and then you need to write a set of policies for that group. And in this slide, you see an example of these four policies that you need to write. But if you're a part of the admin group, you just need these two. Um, so now let's look under the hood and see what happens when you are deploying a function. When you say you write, you have written the code for a function and it's ready to deploy, you can use a single fn project CLI command to perform all the deploy operations in a sequence. We'll look at a demo, but what you essentially end up doing is when deploying, you're building a Docker image from the function. You're providing a definition of the function in a YAML file. That YAML file includes some important configuration information, including the maximum length of the time the function is allowed to execute and the maximum amount of memory that can be allocated to this function. Then there is pushing the image to the specified Docker registry for deployment, uploading the function metadata in the YAML file and the link to the Docker registry where the container is going to be located. All of this metadata is uploaded to the FN server, which is we'll see shortly what happens during invocation. But all this information is now with the FN server during the deployment stage, and this function is then also added to the list of functions that you have, and it is then shown in the OCI console. All right, so we looked at deployment. Now let's see what happens when you are invoking a function. As we discussed, a function in Oracle functions can be invoked through multiple methods. You can use the FN project command line interface, the CLI. You can use the OCI SDKs that we provide. You can use the HTTP invocation endpoint that each function has, or you can use or OCI events to invoke the functions as well. Let's say you're invoking the function and this is the first time. The Oracle Function Service would first verify the request with the IAM service. That's why we have all those IAM policies that we discussed. And if the request passes the authentication and authorization checks, the function service then passes the request to the FN server. All these are the invocation options, and once it is invoked, the check goes to the IAM service. It passes the check, and now it's up to the FN server to now do a few things. The first one is identify the Docker image to pull from the Docker registry. So it's going to get the image and pull it and then execute the function by running the function's image as a container on an instance. This is your VCN in the subnet that we looked at, where you said you want to run your functions. So the FN server is going to get the image and deploy it in a instance running within this subnet. And this subnet is associated with the application to which the function belongs. When the function is executing inside the container, the function can read and write from other resources and services running in the same subnet. For example, it can access the database as a service within the same subnet. It can also read and write from other shared resources in OCI, for example, from object storage, so it's very well integrated in the OCI ecosystem. You can specify, or you have specified optionally the length of time the function is allowed to execute by setting a timeout in the YAML file or in the console that we discussed earlier. The logs are are stored, and we see metrics. We'll talk about metrics shortly. And and when the function has finished executing, and after a period of being idle, the container is then removed. But if the Oracle Function Service receives another call to the same function before the container gets removed, the second request is routed to the same container. And if the function's service receives a call to the function that is currently getting executed inside a running container, the service is going to scale horizontally to serve both incoming requests, and a second Docker container is started. So the horizontal scaling is taken care of for you, uh, and the when to remove a container is also managed for you. You don't have to worry about all of that. All right. The final thing I want to discuss in part two is about function metrics. Uh, there are four different useful metrics that are automatically collected from the function service, and you can access charts related to these metrics from OCI console. Uh, the useful information is related to the total execution duration of your functions in milliseconds, and the invocation count of how many times a function got invoked. And then there are response-related metrics in terms of the number in errors, the number of times a function has failed, and throttles, which means the number of requests that returned a 429 error code of too many requests. All right, so this brings us to the end of part two. We discussed the core concepts of functions, Oracle Function Service, which are applications, functions, invocations, and triggers. We looked under the hood of what happens when you deploy a function with Oracle Function Service, and we also looked at what happens when you invoke an Oracle function, service-based function. And finally, we looked at the metrics that are collected and displayed in OCI console. We actually also looked at the IAM policies you need to use the Oracle function service. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to have you join in part three, where we will look at some use cases, and I will give you a demo of the Oracle function service in action.